robots have arrived. In fact, they are already an important part of our daily existence. What will happen to the world and what will our world look like when robots take all the dirty, dangerous, and basically dull work? How can industry work with governments to make sure that transition is happening safely and also for the best benefit of humankind? To find out, please welcome Nan-Hie from the South China Morning Post, who will be speaking with the COO of Cafe X Technologies, Cynthia Yeung, and co-founder and CEO of Furhat Robotics, Samer Al-Moubayed. Please give them a warm welcome.
I'm just going to start off with everyone, the panelists, Samir and Cynthia. How are robots affecting your daily lives? What are the exciting things that you see they're doing in our society right now?
Sure. So with Cafe X, what we're doing is we're actually automating the cafe experience. How many of you have been to a Starbucks recently? Really? Only so few? And one of the really frustrating things about going to a Starbucks is that there's this really long line, and even when you get to the front, people still might mess up your order. With technology, we can both make that experience much more efficient, as well as much more enjoyable for a lot of people. And so that's one of the many ways that robotics are being brought into our daily lives, is through service robotics in the food and beverage industry.
So where we're going to meet robots? I guess it depends on what we mean by the word robot. I mean, there are lots of robots everywhere. Cars, probably, very soon.
Dishwashers, microwaves.
Dishwashers, smart speakers, so on. But kind of robots, the old vision of a robot that moves and interacts with us, I think it's probably not going to be the home for quite some time, but probably in kind of public spaces, cafes, restaurants, hotels, a clinic, waiting rooms, in schools. Kind of robots today, probably the majority of robots sit in universities and research labs and so on. But I think soon we're going to start seeing them going out into more simpler environments, at the entry of a shopping mall or a clinic, and kind of some of the use cases we showed earlier today. Yeah, but hopefully the home is kind of the final frontier.
And just in case there are any misperceptions about robots in the audience that I just wanted to get away and clear the air for, is there anything you wanted to clear up and clarify about robots that you keep getting confronted with, these misconceptions? Can you I'm sure you get faced with them all the time when you meet people. Let's just clear the air just in case there's some panic and fears that are completely unwarranted.
So I think probably the first is that robots are not nearly as intelligent as you think they are. I think one very common thing that you see is that a robot can probably do a single thing better than the greatest human master in that specific skill, like whether it's like chopping something or maybe like putting two pieces of objects together. But a robot doesn't have nearly the breadth of skills that, say, even a baby might have. So a baby can like roll around, it can recognize its parents, it can maybe like make sounds, it can have all these different types of expressions and grasp objects. Manipulation, which is sort of a subfield of robotics, is actually very, very challenging and is still very much an unsolved problem. So, I think that's sort of one of the biggest misperceptions around robotics is how stupid they actually are.
Yes, very primitive, yeah.
Yeah, probably what Cynthia said, the idea that because a robot kind of interacts with us and maybe speaks and maybe has eyes and a face and so on, we usually compare robots to people. And that makes us feel kind of this idea of panic or, what's the purpose of a human and so on. And that creates a lot of confusion. So suddenly we start talking much more about that than about what are the useful applications for robots, or mainly comparing a robot to other devices like the smartphone and a tablet and so on. These are amazing for some applications, but we sometimes use them in times where we need social interactions, for example. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to see more conversations about where can we use a robot where we're using a tablet today, or a phone, or VR goggles, rather than where do we want to replace people. Yeah.
And I'm sure with your designs, with the Cafe X's robot coffee barista makers to your social robots, you've gone through various prototypes. Can you talk about kind of the lessons you've derived from making your latest prototype in order to be more embraced by the mainstream? Like, can you share some insights?
Yeah, I mean, and not just like, with my own company, but, previously I was at SoftBank Robotics, and I also spoke to a lot of other roboticists, who are working in the field. I think one of the, sort of biggest challenges is that sometimes there are a lot of teams, really brilliant teams, mind you, who are overly focused on the technology and not actually focused on the problem that they're trying to solve. So at the end of the day, for like any of these robotics companies, really what you need to focus on is what is the, product market fit? What is the actual problem that you're solving for? And does that problem require a robotic solution? Or are there maybe even simpler, like archaic solutions that will actually still solve that same problem? And so I think that that's something that, probably a lot of companies need to think more about.
So yeah, I mean, we still have a prototype. So assuming that we know the answer to that question, maybe it's a little bit too early, but some of the lessons we've learned, we felt that, at least at Furhat, one of the philosophies we had was really to open the hardware as soon as possible and try to get an impression of what people want to do with it. Kind of very similar to when you do software, apps and so on. Especially with hardware, it's very difficult to upgrade a hardware. When you launch it, you have to wait, a year and do a huge investment to kind of change the simplest things do certification and so on. So while it's kind of its early stages and a prototype, putting it in the hands of developers and seeing what kind of ideas people come up with, I think has been really powerful for us. Kind of what sensors do we want to put in the robot and what sensors we want to attach externally. And so opening it up as early as possible, I think, has been quite beneficial for us.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get to the big meat of this talk, which is about jobs, because that's a major concern in society. It's once we reach that robot-dominated future, we're going to go through this painful transitional period where there's going to be huge swaths of jobs becoming obsolete, wealth disparity, and so forth, among other consequences. What are we going to do about it? How should we prepare for it? There's been certain proposals that are being tossed around. I think the common one is the universal basic income, which is being kind of advocated by tech leaders like Elon Musk. And what are your thoughts on how we should prepare for that imminent future and some of the solutions that are being aired, like the universal basic income?
So I'm actually a huge proponent of UBI. It's definitely something I would definitely advocate for. But I think before we even get to that question, I think you have to go a step back and really look at whether or not this sort of huge employment issue is really something that we should be focused on. So, from the Industrial Revolution, from steam power to the advent of ATMs, right? When ATMs first came out, there was all this hubbub in the news around, it's going to destroy banks. There aren't going to be any banks anymore because what else are banks going to do besides dispense cash? And we realize, that now, obviously that was a preposterous statement. ATMs haven't taken away every single banking job that ever existed. Instead, what happened was that people were upskilled. So instead of dispensing cash, now their job was to provide financial services, and there's a huge thriving financial sector there. So I think what you're going to see is, even as robotics becomes more and more prevalent, throughout all these different industries, whether it's in the service industry or financial services or what have you, what it's really going to do is it's going to change the nature of jobs. And I think going back to UBI, one of the things that we have to think about there is, as more and more kind of low-level skills and jobs that require low-level skills are taken over through automation and other technologies. What can we do to support people to transition to this new economy? And that's where things like education really come into play.
And what about you? There's also U.S. Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yeung advocating for the universal income of
First
US
Asian American candidate.
But an Asian American candidate, excuse me, thank you for correcting me. That's right, 1,000 U.S. a month was what he was suggesting. And again, thoughts on this universal basic income theory?
Yeah, I guess there are two questions here. One is, do we want people to work more in the future, or do we want people to work better? or have a better, there's lots of talk
Or
about.
why even work, right? Like, why not, like, be creative and have a more fulfilling life?
I mean, every tool we've invented as a species has been to make people's lives easier, give them more time to do maybe more important or interesting things. Today, a lot of people work so that they can live, and it would be amazing to build a society where people work because they want to do the thing that they are doing at work. So. Or can find purpose and so on. So it's much more interesting to talk about like quality of jobs than quantity. And everyone is talking about quantity. 8 million, 800 million jobs are going to be lost, and so on. So that's one thing. The other is kind of if you look probably if you ask my grandfather, he was probably working 12, 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, and he would say like he was very busy all the time. Today, kind of in a country like Sweden, where Furhat comes from, people work 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, 6 weeks holiday, and so on. And if you ask them, people say we're really busy, super busy, we're stressed, and so on. So it's there's a generation shift, but the quality of the work seems to be much more important than how many hours you work and so on.
I mean, I would go one step further than that. I wouldn't talk even about the quality of work. I'd talk about the quality of life. If there were a universe in which it wasn't actually necessary to work, and people could actually just pursue whatever things that they want to do, their passions in life, like why don't we want a world like that, right? So,
well, what about the solution that Bill Gates is proposing? And also, all these other politicians are also advocating this tax on robots, especially the robots that are actually taking human jobs. Any thoughts on the tax on robots itself? Yeah, it's so controversial, but it's getting a lot more headlines lately. So,
yeah. So I, as much as I advocate for UBI, I actually think a robot-specific tax makes no sense purely from a pragmatic perspective. The reason is, first of all, going back to the definition of robots. I don't know how many of you are familiar with U.S. politics or U.S. taxation systems for that matter, but there was actually a 2003 Toy Biz case where Marvel, the parent company Marvel, was actually trying to argue in front of the courts that X-Men and the they weren't dolls because dolls were taxed at a higher rate than other toys. And so, whenever you try to define something in the taxation system, corporations will always find a way to get around that definition. And so really, if we want to be able to fund programs like UBI, what we should really just do is just increase the corporate tax rate rather than have a robot-specific tax.
And you, from a Swedish perspective here, or
Swedish,
famous for taxing high taxes
exactly.
on citizens? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it kind of goes back to what is a robot. There's really no clear definition of what a robot is, and but it's. I guess there are fundamental questions. What kind of society do we want to build? Do we want to take care of people that can't kind of move as fast as other people, can't go into education, maybe the elderlies and so on. So it's really difficult to kind of answer what kind of taxation system you want to build on technologies that make people richer faster. We need to kind of first agree on kind of what kind of society do we want to build. And that I think it's possible, maybe the Bill Gates proposal of how do you tax it and where do you draw the lines is maybe not the right one, but I think the idea is kind of interesting as a principle. Kind of if we are building technologies that have very high barrier to competition, or can make people really rich really fast, or dominate a certain industry, run monopolies and so on, it would be very probably wise to start thinking about how do we want to build a structure that kind of thinks about the rest of the society.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think funding early childhood education and various social programs, I think is definitely something that makes a lot of sense. The question is just how do you pay for it? And so, what you can do is you can have more progressive taxation systems on a personal basis, as well as just increasing tax on corporate profits.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask more specifically, because everyone here is going to see a lot of robots presented at RISE, but also elsewhere in other markets. You're going to see a lot of, to be honest, innovations that are going to end up in the junk bin. And then you're going to see technologies that are also going to make a huge progress and impact in their respective industries. So how do you evaluate technologies that you see that are coming in? What is your criteria to judge something that's being invented? Like how if you see it as actually having real potential, or is something that's just going to become, well, non-successful? Yeah.
I mean, it probably also depends on how you want to define potential, right? So there are definitely a number of robotics companies. Actually, a good number of them have gone down in the last year, which was very, very sad. So Rethink went down, Jibo, Anki, a lot of these really great robotics companies have disappeared. But even though maybe commercially they weren't successful, I think what they have been successful in doing is really building up this great community and next generation of roboticists who have now been burned a little bit and maybe have more realistic expectations when they go out to build the next robotics company. So even though maybe their sort of potential as commercial successes were somewhat limited, I think they had a lot of potential and demonstrated that in terms of inspiring a new generation of companies.
Yeah, I mean, who are we to judge what other people are putting their lives into building? I think it's a very difficult question. Probably investors have a theory on how to choose these technologies. But I think usually when a technology becomes mainstream, there have been lots of people who have paved the way, kind of like the social robot companies that have tried different commercial models and maybe failed and so on. But I think one of the things that we value a lot at when building a robot or any kind of hardware device that's interacting with people is to try to, as early as possible, I don't know how many people here are building hardware, but try to, as early as possible, think about the user experience. Because usually these things are built by engineers that are very excited about seeing things start to move and talk and so on. So and we become very biased to how we look at the thing that we're creating. So, having more designers in the team is something very early on is very important. Getting more, taking videos of seeing how people interact with it and getting that user experience of how do people want to use this device rather than, how cool is it and how fast does it move and, I think is key to build something that you end up making sure that people really want to talk to or want to use.
I mean, I will also add, inspiration aside, if what you're looking for is more short-term commercial success, probably things that you want to keep an eye out on, are things like how autonomous is the robot truly. How intelligent is the robot really? What kind of maintenance is required on it? Some types of robots require a lot of hand-holding. There's actually, talking about jobs, there's an entire new category of jobs created at this point where it's, just the person's job to handle the robot. So a lot of the self-driving cars, a lot of the sort of various delivery bots. Very often at this stage, they actually still have, robot handlers that just sort of follow it around, or they're there inside the car just in case something goes wrong. So, entire new generation of jobs or new category of jobs are also being created. And again, going back to more short-term commercial success, really it just comes down to product market fit. What problem are you trying to solve? Who are you trying to solve it for? And can you actually make money off of it, based off of how much the robot costs?
Perfect. Samir and Cynthia, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.